Hello, everyone. Welcome to this DecisionWise webinar. My name is Justin Warner, and I will be the host of today's webinar. Our topic today is 360-degree feedback and the employee experience. I'm joined today by our Vice President of Assessments, Dave Long, and our Vice President of Consulting, Christian Nilsson. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. I guess the first thing that we want to do is kind of talk to an agenda. Really, the purpose of this entire webinar is to help you think through building your employee experience and using 360-degree feedback as a tool to do that. And so with that in mind, we want to take a step back first as part of the agenda to talk through some definitions. How do culture, employee experience, employee engagement all relate to each other? What are some of the major elements of culture? We want to introduce to you to an employee experience maturity model and where 360s might fit in your progression in building an outstanding employee experience in your organization. We'll talk about competencies and competency models. We'll talk about some 360 strategies and how you might tailor that to not just improve individual leaders or managers, but to improve the overall organization, and then how you might tailor a 360 strategy to or the best practices that you use with 360 in order to match the strategy that you're looking for. So that's what we're going to be covering today. I guess as a first step on that roadmap, let's start with a few definitions. Definition number one that we'll be using these words throughout the presentation. The first one is culture. A very dictionary definition of culture or organizational culture would be a set of values, norms, guiding beliefs, and understandings that is shared by members of an organization and is taught to new members as the way to feel, think, and behave. A kind of back of the napkin definition that I've heard very often of culture, and especially when we're talking about culture of organizations, is they say it's the way we do things around here. So I'll be using that kind of shorthand definition. If you think about culture as the way we do things around here, well, then that can help frame the way we think the rest of the things we'll be talking about today. If culture is the way we do things around here, employee experience is the sum of perceptions employees have about their interactions with the organization in which they work. In other words, it is the impact of culture, organizational culture, on employees, how they experience the way we do things around here. And the last definition will be employee engagement. DecisionWise, at our heart, we are an employee engagement company. And engagement we have defined in our books on engagement as an emotional state where we feel passionate, energetic, and committed toward our work. In turn, we fully invest our best selves in the work that we do. And another way to look at engagement would be engagement is the employee's emotional response to the employee experience. Maybe better put, engagement would be an employee's positive emotional response to the employee experience. In other words, they have experienced the culture in the organization and they're responding favorably to it. So yeah, go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, and I just wanted to do what Justin mentioned we would do. I wanted to talk over you, but these definitions are great and they're helpful for kind of setting the stage for our 360 conversation. One thing I wanted to just add is a lot of times we talk about employee engagement as employees accepting the invitation that's coming from the employee experience. Through the experience we create for our employees, we're inviting them to engage. And so just walking through from culture to experience to engagement, I think is a great way to set the stage for this broader conversation on 360.
So all this to say, engagement is an outcome of the employee experience, or EX as we may call it as we go through this presentation. And employee experience is an outcome of organizational culture, or in other words, employee experience is an outcome of the way we do things around here. In order to impact employee experience and ultimately employee engagement, organizations must change the culture, or they must change the way we do things around here. So let's talk more about that. What do we mean by change the culture? Well, there are major elements of culture that every organization has. And sometimes this culture is by design and sometimes it's not. So you can see mission and values is going to help shape the culture. Goals, what goals we have at a department and organizational level, that's going to shape the culture. The strategy we take, the procedures that we use in order to accomplish that strategy, incentive programs, all of these things help shape the culture. One of the things that really helps determine the culture or the way we do things around here is a set of leadership norms and behaviors. And sometimes that is very planned and designed, and sometimes that is something that just sort of happens because different leaders have different personalities and things like that. Those are all things we're, of course, in favor of, is different leaders having different styles and personalities and things like that. But that's definitely something that will help shape the culture of an organization. If we look at the organization's culture, we can also look at how is our organization and the culture of our organization impacting stakeholders. So there's a number of different stakeholders of culture. The first stakeholder may be, the way you might see it would be investors, or another organizational stakeholder might be your customers. Another organizational stakeholder could be the community where you exist and where you operate. And another one is your employees. Employees are definitely a stakeholder of your organization and the culture of the organization. What makes employees unique, and there's some back and forth on this, between the different stakeholders, but the employees also have a direct impact on the other stakeholders of the organization. So whenever we're talking about shaping culture, we want to shape culture with investors and customers and all stakeholders in mind. We would want to shape our culture in order to best serve the needs of those stakeholders. But one way to kind of indirectly impact positively all the other stakeholders is to shape culture and design your culture for the best employee experience that they might respond to, an invitation to employees to respond to, and then make a better experience there in turn for all of the other stakeholders that the organization has. So employees we view as a very strategic stakeholder of the organization. And that's why when we talk about shaping culture, we want to make sure we're thinking about all of the stakeholders of culture. That's an important thing. We want to know if we make a change to our process or to our strategy, how does that impact our customer? We definitely want to know that. But we also want to know, how is it impacting our employees? And there will be times when you make decisions that will be in favor of your customers that will at times negatively impact employees. But we want to understand when we make changes to the culture or the way we do things around here, how does it impact all of these stakeholders? In particular, how does it impact employees? Because they can have a return impact on all the other stakeholders of the organization. So we talk about deliberate culture. In other words, culture by design. When we're thinking about organizational culture or the way we do things around here, so much of it just happens to organizations organically. It's very hard to design every aspect of your culture. It's very hard to kind of step back and say, everything that we do here is going to be by design. We understand there are things that are decisions that are made and little things that happen every day in an organization that shape the culture that are not necessarily things that are planned for or designed. But deliberate or intentional culture is culture by design. So we're going to talk more about this culture by design. Culture should be designed with organizational stakeholders in mind, all of them. One critical organizational stakeholder is employees. So we're going to talk more about how do we design the culture in order to deliver the best experience to our employees, which would then in turn lead them to engage in our culture.
I love the use of the word deliberate. Or sometimes we talk active versus passive culture, but taking an active role and thinking through these stakeholder groups and designing or even tuning a culture to get the outcomes or to create the experience that we want for these different stakeholder groups.
Okay, let's talk about how 360-degree feedback might tie into this culture design. We're just going to go to the basics of 360-degree feedback. At the very basic level, we're saying that 360-degree feedback can help us to design an employee experience. So this is a maturity model. This is the progression that we see organizations have for employee experience. And most all organizations, when they come to DecisionWise and they're looking for help in their employee experience and improving it or building it, they come to us in a state of passive employee experience. And the first step along the road that they take in order to move from passive to actively managing their employee experience is to use a survey, start measuring engagement, take some level of organizational action, and then communicate what we're doing, communicate some of the results of that survey, and communicate the actions to the organization. At the most basic level, we see organizations kind of dipping their toe into employee experience design by taking a survey about how things are right now and making some changes based on the feedback in that survey. What happens over time, though, is that organizations will see some benefit from doing a survey and making improvements with the survey. And what happens is that the leaders of the organization start to see the benefit, and they start to understand, okay, engagement can really get us to where we need to go. When we have that leader commitment, leaders start to buy into this idea that we need to create an outstanding employee experience and really invest in engagement. We need to be able to say, okay, leaders, as HR professionals, we need to be able to say, okay, leaders, the best way to drive engagement in this organization is actually not through a survey. It's actually going to be through the management structure. So this kind of middle level of maturity for organizations is that they begin driving excellent employee experience through the leadership structure. They drive engagement through the leadership structure. And that means as an HR team, you have to think about, how do we expand ownership of the employee experience beyond just the HR team that's running the engagement survey, and now helping managers understand you own this, you are part owners with all of us in this EX and building the EX and engagement in the organization. So expand ownership, build manager accountability, expand listening campaign. These are all things that organizations can do to start to drive engagement through the leadership structure. Now, there are higher levels in this, but I would say most organizations are trying to get to the point where they're driving engagement, employee experience through the management structure. So let's talk more about how to do that. Can we hold managers accountable? Can we do this through engagement surveys? Many organizations run engagement surveys. Let's talk about if that's possible. Well, the purpose of an engagement survey is actually to provide feedback to the organization. It is not as effective when giving feedback to individuals. Now, we offer tools as an engagement company. We offer tools for managers to kind of help them build experience on their teams. We have manager reports. We will give them, based on their results, prescriptive recommendations of what they can do. There's a supervisor section in every survey that we run that gives some feedback about the outcomes of good supervision. But those are kind of the limited tools that we offer in order to help managers build engagement through or employee experience through an engagement survey. So here's an example. I mentioned that there are questions in the engagement survey that are directed at the supervisor. So here's what the questions look like. My supervisor gives me ongoing feedback about my performance. My supervisor regularly recognizes my efforts and contributions. My supervisor supports my efforts to develop and grow. My supervisor cares about me as a person. These are all really important parts of being a supervisor, that you are giving feedback, that you're giving recognition, that you're helping people grow, that you care about your people, really important parts. And it certainly is communicating a message to the organization. When this goes out in an organizational survey, it communicates that these are important to the organization. It tells managers in a way what to do. It doesn't necessarily tell them how to do it. So engagement surveys are designed to measure outcomes of the employee experience. They focus on what to work on, but not necessarily how to do it. So let's talk about then going from managing employee experience through this engagement survey and managing it through a 360. And we're going to do that first by talking about critical moments in employee experience. Christian, I know you're fond of talking about kind of some of the peak and end moments of an experience and how that might have an impact on employees in an organization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, specifically the peak and end moments, the planned and unplanned.
Peak and end,
yeah. So there's this concept called the peak end heuristic that we, as human beings, we place extra emphasis on the emotional peak of an experience, the most dramatic moment, as well as how the experience ended. So the examples that you often use is, if I think back about my taking my family to Disneyland or something like that, I don't necessarily remember all of the lines and those types of things, but I remember taking my daughter on the Pirates of the Caribbean for the first time, and kind of having this emotional connection there. I also remember what it was like as we left that experience. And so, and if something really positive happened on my way out of that vacation, that tends to really influence my overall memory of the experience, of how I'm rating it overall. So those peak moments, those ending moments, have a lot of importance. Now, what's interesting is you can't necessarily script those out always. And so you really have to focus on developing cultural expectations, as well as, making sure our managers have clear leadership competency areas that they're focusing on to create that right experience. You can't legislate every single moment or script every moment. You have to rely on tuning that culture to create those right moments.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I think what I really find interesting about that is hopefully we're not planning for the end moments of most of your employees. Hopefully you're keeping and retaining your employees as much as possible, but you can think of different experiences
Yeah.
as being transition experiences. And like if I'm leaving one role for another role,
Right.
or if I'm at an anniversary, that might be I'm closing up a year with the organization. So you can look at some of the peak moments and the end moments. And many of those peak moments can actually be charted out on a calendar. The day you get hired,
Right.
your onboarding, your training.
Ending could be just the ending of those first 90 days onboarding.
Right.
How did that experience end? That actually influences how you view the entire onboarding experience. If you ended on a high with some kind of moment of connection with a supervisor or some sense of accomplishment, then onboarding is seen as a win in your mind going forward.
Yeah. So these peak moments, or what we might term critical moments in the employee experience, are things that we want to be able to make sure that the organization and its leaders are at their best in these moments. So there's two different categories of moments that we're going to talk about. One is Chronos moments, and these are moments in the employee experience or any experience that happen at predetermined points in time during an employee's term of service with an organization. So we know when the hire date is, we know when onboarding is happening, we know when training is happening, anniversaries, performance reviews. These are all peak moments for people. And so we want to make sure that we're designing the experience. And we can do that. We can actually design the experience. You can actually design your onboarding experience to make it the best experience you possibly can. And you can get feedback about your onboarding experience once you've done it, so you can see, how do we make it better for the next group that comes in? Really a simplified way to look at this is to look at these Chronos moments and say, how can we best design the experience at these moments that are so critical in the way that an employee will ultimately judge the experience? What about, though, these moments that are not as predictable? They happen between the date I'm hired and the day I leave at completely random intervals. We call these Kairos moments. Kairos is roughly translated from the Greek as the right moment, or moments of truth that are inherently unpredictable and tend to reveal the underlying values and culture of the organization. So this could be any number of things, but I'm just going to put up a few examples on the slide. When an employee makes a mistake, a customer complains, when we have a reduction in force, when there's a heavy workload. It's funny because all these kind of seem negative, but what about when we have successes, or we have a customer compliment? How are we treating that? Lifestyle changes or personal issues that come up. What happens when somebody has their first child or adopts somebody, or whatever it might be, right? So we have all these things that happen in a term of an employee, both in their personal life and in the life of the organization, that are going to be peak moments for them. They're going to look back and they will remember these things 10 years from now. How did the organization react? How did it treat me in these moments? And the gatekeepers, or for these moments, are really managers and leaders in the organization. How they react and respond to these moments really matters. So you can't plan ahead for these moments. You cannot plan. You don't know when the customer complaint is going to come in. And so we can't say, okay, we can't pre-design how that experience is going to go. However, we can sort of design our leaders to meet these Kairos moments in the best way they possibly can. So let's talk about preparing for Kairos moments. Because they are unpredictable, it's very difficult to seek feedback from employees about their experience during these moments. You don't send out a survey like you would to a customer that you knew had a bad experience. Customer has a bad experience, they waited in line too long, you send them a survey. We're not necessarily doing that with our employees. Instead, defined leadership competencies and behaviors should help prepare the organizations and its leaders to respond to Kairos moments in a way that drives engagement. This is something I hear, and Christian and I work with a lot of leadership teams in both engagement and in 360. And something that we hear oftentimes, we'll see an organization struggling with communication. And the top leaders in the organization feel like, well, I'm communicating all the time. I don't understand, commonly heard thing. Why don't our managers communicate? So my response in that situation is to say, what expectations have you set for how, when, and what managers communicate?
It's so consistent across every organization, every industry. Managers are often promoted and nobody tells them one of your jobs, one of your key responsibilities is to function, to help facilitate communication to your employees, from your employees, and just make sure that the information is flowing. And it's a lot of times it's just not happening because the expectation was never set.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you'll have managers or leaders in a meeting and there'll be 100 things talked about in an hour-long meeting. And at the end of the meeting, there's 100 different things that were talked about, and there's probably 10,000 different interpretations of what could then be communicated to the staff. Are we then turning around and saying, okay, these are the things that should be communicated out of that? I mean, we could talk all day about kind of the challenges that organizations have with communication. But and this is just one example. Leadership teams could be frustrated that frontline employees aren't getting enough feedback, or that the organization is not recognizing their people enough. They could be frustrated by all these things, and they could think, hey, I'm setting the perfect example of this, and let's just assume for argument's sake that they are setting the perfect example. I'm setting the perfect example for this. Why is this not something that's being carried through? And I think Christian and I could both tell you stories about organizations that we have seen grow from a very small group of people. Like, organizations start and it's like 10 people and they all are sitting around the same table. And so now the organization, like, there's nothing hidden there. Anything that's communicated, everybody can hear. And the example of leadership set by the leader of that organization is sitting right there at the same table as me. Well, then organizations grow, and now we're all in different offices, and maybe now we're in different buildings, and then maybe now we're in different states, and now we're in different countries, and we can no longer depend upon the example of a really great founder or leader to carry through the rest of the organization. I sometimes call that organizational telephone, or leadership telephone, which is, I set an example, and so the next level down tries to emulate that example, but they don't get it quite right. And so then the next level after that of leadership tries to emulate that example, and they don't get it quite right. And then it goes on and on and on until you're down to your front level managers. And now you have your 6 or 7 layers removed from the great example of your top leadership of how to lead. And now it's completely different. It's happening completely different at the frontline level than it is at the top level. And not only that, you have one frontline manager that is leading in a completely different way than the one adjacent to that frontline manager, et cetera, et cetera. And so now we have all these different ways of dealing with people and managing people and leading people within the organization. And it doesn't feel consistent, and it doesn't feel cohesive. And so it's anybody's guess when a Kairos moment or a critical moment comes up. It's anybody's guess how that's going to be dealt with. And leaders can be frustrated with that all day long, and they will be frustrated with that all day long. But at the end of the day, we haven't really set an expectation other than to say, look at me, do it how I'm doing it. Okay, So best practices for setting expectations. So we know now, in order for us to make sure that we're designing, this is culture by design, we're designing an employee experience. So now we're setting expectations of how leaders deal with critical moments and really everyday moments. We're setting expectations for how they might act and behave in those situations. So we want to communicate expectations broadly. Whatever we're communicating, our leaders, the top leaders in the organization, should be able to model those expectations. So the fastest way to hypocrisy is to say, we expect all of our managers to do it this way, but we're going to do it a different way. So whenever we communicate expectations broadly of how to lead in the organization, we should also be ready as a leadership team to say, we're going to adopt these ourselves, and we're going to try to be the best example of this in the rest of the organization. And organizations should provide tools and training to managers to help meet the expectations they're setting out. You obviously are going to hire for the expectations. This might become part of your interview process to say, this is what an excellent leader in our organization does, these things, they're competent in these areas. That becomes part of your interview process. So you're looking for that. You're trying to find leaders that best exemplify that for sure. But also we need to be able to provide the resources, the tools, the trainings to managers in order to help bring them up to speed on some of those skills, competencies, behaviors that you're setting as an expectation.
Hey, David, Christian. Oh, sorry, Christian, I cut you off really fast, but just maybe elaborate a little bit on this as well about the expectation gaps and what that does to the employee experience too.
Well, I love that Dave mentioned, the potential for hypocrisy. And a lot of times it's just we're unaware that we're saying one thing and creating a different experience. And so where we're headed in some of this is, building self-awareness and helping leaders understand the experience they're creating. And is that aligned with the espoused cultural values and the experience we want to create as an organization? In terms of these expectations, I think a lot of organizations, when they promote someone to a leadership role or hire them to a leadership role, they're very, very familiar with giving people operational metrics for success. These are your targets. So you need to, hit these goals. This is how we're measuring success. And they're less often very clear on these behavioral expectations or these competency expectations, that this is how we expect a leader to behave consistently with the culture that we're building and promoting going forward. And so it's very important to address both sides of the house. Yes, operational success, of course, but also the experience expectations. What behaviors are we expecting of our leadership to make sure that we're creating the right experience that invites engagement, that promotes the right experience for all of those stakeholder groups that Dave mentioned earlier?
Yeah, and Justin mentioned expectation gaps, and maybe we'll just talk about that for a second. First of all, setting proper expectations with your leadership team on how to behave, act, where they need to build skill and competency, that takes some of the ambiguity out of leadership for your leadership team. It says, oh, okay, this is how I should act. And maybe some of them already have the skill, but they just don't know, how to deploy the skill. But the other thing that it does when you communicate expectations broadly, you're not just communicating the expectations to the leadership team, you're communicating expectations to employees. So now my employees, my frontline employees, my individual contributors know the expectations that have been set for leaders in this organization on how to act. So now we're creating a level of accountability, and we get, and Justin mentioned expectation gap. An expectation gap is simply an experience that has changed based on how I've actually experienced things as compared to my expectation. So if I have an expectation that my manager is going to be having a weekly one-on-one with me, for example, and I almost never meet with my manager one-on-one, then my experience by comparison is worse than if that expectation had never been set. And not only that, I am probably in a position where I'm either stewing about it or I'm in some way holding my manager accountable to the expectation that the organization has set that I'm going to have a one-on-one.
I think one of the best examples of those expectation gaps might be we can see that in our engagement data when we cut things by tenure. We see something called the honeymoon effect. When an employee is new to a role or to the organization, very favorable perceptions across most aspects of the employee experience. That drops off pretty quickly. Now, it does for a few reasons. One, we stop growing as quickly as the longer we're with an organization, but also some of those expectation gaps start to appear. Hey, this place isn't as great as perhaps I was led to believe during the recruiting or the onboarding process, or I'm starting to see some inconsistencies. Those expectation gaps creep in and damage the employee experience.
So we set expectations for managers. One way to do that is by setting expectations through competency models. And I'm going to use the word competency model, but many times I've heard this called a success profile, and it takes other names as well. But I'll call it, as some people will call them, operating principles. Any number of things that this might go by. But competency model is what I'm going to call it, and essentially it would be a collection of competencies of behaviors that are set as an expectation to leaders in the organization. And you can have competency models at every level of the organization. If you wanted it for individual contributors, if you wanted a different set of competencies for executive leaders, you could do that. But I'm in favor of setting a very consistent set of expectations for leaders across the organization. So if I'm experiencing leadership here, then it would be the same way as I would experience the same way if I were to go from here to our New York office, and I'd experience leadership there in much the same way. And so I'm actually in favor of keeping a pretty consistent expectations throughout the organization. Now, there may be different expectations that you set for different roles, and that's totally appropriate. But when we're talking about a leadership competency model, we're talking about something that gets communicated broadly, and therefore it's something that we would want everybody to sort of espouse and work toward. So an effective leadership competency will define competencies associated with effective leadership, set behavioral expectations for leaders and members of the organization, inform leadership development programs and training, guide leadership actions and practices, and help leaders navigate critical moments in the employee experience. So these are all things that we're wanting to do with our effective leadership competency. So we're being specific about behaviors that we're looking for. We're defining the competencies that we're wanting people to achieve. We are informing, so where are we lacking? This is going to inform L&D and the organization. If we have leaders that are struggling with a certain aspect of the competency model, then L&D is jumping in and saying, okay, we're creating development programs in this area and helping people get up to speed. It's guiding leadership actions and practices. And then it also, when we get to that critical moment, when we get to that Kairos moment, we are helping this competency model should shape the actions of our managers in those situations. Notice the difference. So this is a 360 versus an engagement survey. An engagement survey is going to focus on this outcome. My manager cares about me as a person. So if a manager on an engagement survey scores low in that area, then they know, okay, I've got to work on caring about my people a little bit more. A 360 competency is going to say, look, our competency is caring, and we might have a definition for what caring is, but the behaviors that we are actually measuring in a 360 would look more like this. Demonstrates a personal interest in the well-being of others, makes time for other people, sympathizes with others meeting personal or professional challenges, and provides help when others are overworked or stressed. Now, in your organization, caring may be something different. So I don't get stuck on our definition of caring here. And you may define it a different way. You may say there's more behaviors than just the 4 that I'm showing that lead to caring, and that would be perfectly fine. But you can see the difference between my manager cares about me. That's an outcome. I haven't really defined it very well, and I wouldn't know by looking at an engagement survey exactly what to do in order to change that. And laying out behaviors. Okay, so this is someone who's going to ask me about my personal life and my personal well-being. This is somebody that's going to make time for me. This is somebody that's going to sympathize with me when I'm meeting professional challenges or personal challenges. And this is someone that's going to provide help when I'm overworked or stressed. So though that goes a much farther down the road of describing what exactly we're looking for when we say my manager cares about me as a person. And now if somebody scores lower and, for example, makes time for other people, now they have a pretty clear path forward of what they need to do. Now, they still may not know exactly how they're going to make time for other people and how they're going to get time into their schedule to make it available to other people, but they've got a path forward that they know that at least they have to make time for other people for us to really show that we're caring in the organization.
Right. So there's a granularity in a 360 that's not in the engagement. It's specifically designed around these key behaviors. And at its best, the competencies are dialed in specifically to the culture that the organization is intent on preserving or building, focused on, and it can be dialed in very, very specifically.
And for those of you who think this is a piece of candy, on the right-hand side, this is actually double helix. We're saying, look, a 360 will help kind of build the DNA of an organization.
Yeah. I thought that was a Werther's original icon, but that is a DNA logo or icon on the right.
Double helix.
Double helix. There we go.
All right. All right. So you're building an organizational competency model or a success profile. I mean, you're saying that what makes leaders successful in the organization. Now, you can go to many places and be able to identify success profiles of leaders. What makes a leader successful? So you might kind of go that route, and you might choose to adopt an existing competency model. So there are many competency models out there. DecisionWise has a leadership competency model. We'll talk about that here in a second, just to kind of give you an example of what a leadership competency model might look like. But there are existing competencies models out there that you might choose to adopt. You might also create a model from an existing competency library. DecisionWise also has a competency library that we say, look, not all organizations are the same. And what makes a successful leader in a manufacturing organization may not necessarily be the same thing that makes it a successful leader in a healthcare organization. Sure, there will be universal virtues of leadership. Certainly, there are things that we could carry over between the two. There are qualities of leaders that will apply no matter where you go, but we want to be open to the idea that your organization may have some unique factors that you would say, look, in order to meet the challenges of our organization, our leaders need to rise to the occasion in this area. You know, Christian and I work with an organization that's very customer focused. And so when they define behaviors and expectations for their organization, they're very focused on the customer with all of those expectations that they're giving to leaders. It's very much customer focused. And so depending on your organization, your strategy, your culture, the way you do things in your organization, this may look a little differently. And so you may want to look at kind of more of a taxonomy of many competencies and say, that's one that I want, that's another one that I want, and these are the 10 competencies we're going to choose and go forward with. You might also take kind of a hybrid approach of adjusting existing models or competencies to better fit your own culture in your organization. In other words, you take a DecisionWise competency model and you say, I need to adjust the wording here. Or you take some competencies and say, all right, I like those 4 behaviors, but it also means this. This is another behavior that a caring manager has. So you might also take the approach of adjusting a current model in order to better fit your culture. And the fourth thing would be, maybe you already have a success profile for your leaders. Maybe you already have a competency model that you've communicated, and you're looking for a way to hold leaders accountable to that competency model. You've trained on it, you've communicated it, and now you're looking for a way to hold it accountable. So these are all ways that you can do it. And there are, of course, different variations of this. These are 4 major ways that you might come up with a competency model for your organization. But the first step is adopting. Go ahead.
David, Christian, a good question that came in. How do competency models interact with guiding principles? What's the relationship between those two?
So obviously, if you have guiding principles or values in place, then you would want to design your competency model in a way that makes sure that you are fulfilling those guiding principles or values through your leadership team. So they would work in concert with each other. Now, guiding principles is another way of looking at this. It's just that guiding principles are not going to get specific to behaviors as much. So I think guiding principles is a great thing to do. These are guiding principles for good leadership in this organization. That's an expectation that you can communicate broadly, but it's not so much something that you could put onto a 360 and move into accountability.
And Dave, to further with that point, I think your next slide might even help us as an example of how we kind of map these foundational areas to underlying competencies. That might be one way we do that with guiding principles. But agreed, typically those are broad, high-level statements, very important items, but to operationalize it, we have to take it down a level in detail to get to competencies and behavioral statements.
Yeah, and to Christian's point, this is an example of a leadership competency model. We're going to use the decision-wise leadership intelligence competencies. And essentially what we've done is we've said, look, there are three major areas that we at Decision-Wise believe are critical with all the organizational stakeholders in mind. They are critical competencies that a leader must exhibit in most organizations. Now, an organization may say, well, we want to swap out this competency or that competency, or we think that this behavior is a little bit, misspoken for our culture. That all may be true, but we've got these foundational competencies. We're essentially saying, look, an effective leader is going to be able to get results. They're getting results. They're going to be able to lead change, huge part of leadership, and they're going to be able to engage their people. Getting results, leading change, engaging people. Now, those may be, kind of guiding principles that we assign to the organization, but what do each of those mean? Now we break it down into sub-competencies or more granular competencies to say, all right, what does getting results mean? It means that I have great professional expertise. It means I have a results orientation. It means that I'm empowering my people, I'm holding them accountable, and I'm focusing on the customer. What does leading change mean? It means that I'm able to align my team with the organization. It means that I'm able to engage in basic change management practices. It means that I'm able to collaborate with other departments and I'm able to innovate, and so on and so forth, right? So we have these foundational competencies that kind of say, look, here's a basic model for leadership. Very simply, as a leader, you need to get results, lead change, and engage your people. But if we look at this more granularly, we'd say, okay, but there's competencies that feed into these major areas that are also critical for a leader in our organization. Okay, in addition to that, maybe these aren't the competencies you're looking for. Well, there's many competencies out there, and there are different competency libraries out there. This is ours. This would be, 80 unique competencies that we have in ours. For example, if you decide global mindset is something that you need, or if you decide courage is something you need in your leadership team, or creativity, or whatever it might be, you'd be able to say, look, I like this model, but I want to bring in some of these other competencies. Or you might just say, I'm going to pick the 10 most critical competencies for leaders in our organization here, and we're going to put that into a competency model and create an assessment out of it.
Hey, Dave, will you take a second and just elaborate a little bit more on the accountability? So we've set these competencies, we have the expectations set. Where does accountability come in, and how 360s are used to help drive accountability?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the next place I'm going here. So good lead in, Justin. I think we'll talk about that here in a second. Because when we look at 360s, usually, and this is for those of you who have kind of worked with 360s on a professional level, some of you have probably implemented 360s in your organization, at least on some level. Oftentimes we're looking at a 360 on kind of one continuum, which is, are we doing this for development purposes or are we doing it for performance purposes? 360s for development would be very sort of open-ended in terms of what does the manager want to work on, what's most important to that person that's going through the 360, let them choose their development path, allow them to have some coaching along with it. They could share their 360 with their manager, or they might not share their 360 with the manager. All these things, we love development 360s. We absolutely love them. And we think it's a great way to sort of introduce a competency model into the organization by saying, look, here's the competency model. We put it into a 360, competencies and behavioral statements. We get feedback on each of those behaviors. We provide it to a leader and we say, look, leader, here's what you're doing well. Here's where you maybe have some gaps. Here's what you can develop. And they work on developing some things from that going forward. So that's really a development exercise. When we're talking about accountability, we're really talking about making sure that not only are we developing in this area, but leaders are being held accountable to the expectations that we've set. And so that feels like it has more of a performance angle with it, right? It's more performance oriented. And so we would take the same competency model that we used in development, and we might change around the behavioral statements a little bit to make them more concrete and observable behaviors. And we would put the same competency model to work in a performance evaluation of leaders. So the same competency model, same competencies, but we're measuring now based on how did you perform in these areas as opposed to what do you want to develop in these areas. One's kind of looking at the past, the other one's kind of looking into the future and what I want to develop. And both things can be utilized and both things can come from the exact same competency model. Here's the other way to look at this. And very often we have heard people, we've had many conversations with organizations where we say, is this for performance or is this for development? We're more and more, we're having the conversation, is this 360 that you're running for the individual or is it for the organization? So if we were to put this into a kind of a 2x2 matrix here, we would see we have 360s that we run for individuals, and they can be for development and for performance. Individual development, we have a leader that we really want to, they're high potential. We really want to give them a little boost in development. Therefore, we're going to run a single 360 for that leader. Or we have an underperforming leader and we want to bring in a 360 to kind of give them some extra guidance on what they need to do in order to improve their performance. That's how we've traditionally looked at 360s, as an individual tool. Now we want to expand your vision for how to use 360s to say we're going to go from an individual tool to an organizational tool. So we're no longer thinking about a 360 program for individual development, although that's always going to be a part of every 360 program. But now we're thinking about it as organizational development. We're looking at it as a culture change initiative. We're looking at 360 programs as something that will help change our culture and improve our employee experience. Now it becomes far more important for us to handpick, select, and curate the competency model. The competencies that we're choosing are critical because it is foundational to how we're building our organization and how we lead in the organization. So when I'm rolling out a program for organizational development, I'm saying I'm going to take some extra time up front and make sure that we get these expectations that we're setting right. Then I'll roll it out to the organization as a development instrument and say, okay, leaders, here's your expectations. Let's see what you can do to develop in these areas of expectation. And eventually I'm going to build that into my performance mechanism, whether it be an annual performance review or just attaching multi-rater or a 360 to an organizational performance review. So using 360s for organizational development, some things to keep in mind. You want to be deliberate about selecting a competency model that really defines a successful leader in your organization. You want to integrate competencies into learning and development programs for leaders. You want to create broad accountability for leaders by communicating leadership expectations to the whole organization. You want to use 360s to provide feedback for development. And you want to incorporate 360 into performance reviews, or incorporate your competency model into performance reviews. Okay. Now, whatever strategy you choose, and some of you have come to us with never having run a 360, and you're like, well, I just want to run one 360 for one leader. That is great to do, and you're going to improve the performance of that leader and the awareness of that leader just by running them through this process of getting feedback and developing. It's a terrific way to do that.
Yeah, and I'll add, terrific way to do that. Even if we are not starting with a competency model, we've got defined or these nice broad refined instruments that can help get started on 360 development with leadership. So don't let the fact that you don't have a competency model yet stop you from leveraging the power of 360s.
I mean, we work with a lot of organizations that say, the first thing they say to us is, we just want to, it's a very inexpensive way to kind of dip your toe into this area and see how it might work. And so they come to us and say, we want to run a pilot. There's a team that we have that is a strategic team in our organization. We're looking for a development opportunity for them. We want to use a generic competency model, and we want to put them through a development 360. That's a 360 for individual development and a little bit for team development. Okay, great. So that is something that you can completely do, and it would be a great way to kind of introduce your organization to 360s. And then as you kind of build along, and again, we're going to use that word maturity, along maturity, you might think, what we need to do? We have different leaders acting in different ways at these critical moments, and it's really creating inconsistent experience across our organization. And we have the buy-in from our leadership team. We know that we need to engage our people and create a great experience for our people in order to sustain or maintain a strategic advantage in our industry or in our space. I really want to start designing our culture. Then you might want to think about changing your strategy from individual development into organizational development, and really thinking, okay, you can start with the same generic competency model and work back from that, or you can say, we're going to throw that out, and we're just going to design our own competencies and say, these are the competencies that are going to work best in our unique culture. So how you go about that, and it's just something that just to kind of, we are running out of time, so I'm not going to get deep into kind of best practices around 360. That's a different webinar. but what you choose in terms of your strategy, if you're doing this for performance or for development, if you're doing this for an individual or an organization, is going to inform how you design your program. So, and there's decision points along the way that you want to say you would do differently if you're doing it for an individual than an organization. You do it differently if you're doing it for performance or for development. And the things that you consider are assessment design or competency design. How does somebody that's going through this program select the raters who are going to be giving them the thing? Do those raters need to be approved by somebody? How many groups do we allow? How many raters do we allow into it? Who controls the report? Does that go straight to HR? Is that controlled by the person going through the 360? Is it controlled by a manager? How do we get this person to make productive use of the 360? Do we have a debrief? Is it a conversation with the manager? Is HR involved in this in some way? What are we using for internal and external benchmarks? And how do we then take all the data that we're collecting and use it for the benefit of the overall organization? So all these things are things that you would want to consider when you decide, I'm going to use 360. You want to first say, what's the strategy that I'm employing? And then you want to say, okay, based on that strategy, what are the best things for me to do in order to make the best use of this program in my organization?
Right. Hey, Dave, I know we're about ready to wrap up. We've had a couple of questions around minimum and maximum number of competencies. Can you just quick address that? Like what might a minimum amount be, or how many is too many?
Yeah, and I think you can go to, if you really want to simplify it, you use foundational competencies like we use, and just say these are the 4 major areas so that anybody in the organization could recite it. I think it gets a little bit too big anytime we get over 15 competencies.
Right.
If we're looking at 15 or 20 competencies, it's probably too many competencies for a leader to keep track of and develop in. And then it would probably oversimplify it to limit yourself to 5 or 6 competencies. There's probably more to leadership in your organization than that. Christian, do you have a take on that?
No, I think that's spot on, and especially if you're mapping to organizational values or things, think through. If you have 4 values, then it's pretty easy to say, well, we're probably going to be shooting at 3 to 4 competencies per value to make sure that we have enough detail there without overwhelming the leader. But there's a sweet spot, and it depends on the environment and each situation. But I think that's some general some good guidance there.
And we are administering 360s on many different competency models. So I would say they range usually, 90% of them are going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 competencies.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Good question. All right. We're just wrapping this up now. And just in summary, we just want you to remember employee experience is an outcome of organizational culture. It's the impact of culture on employees. And so with that in mind, we believe that culture should be designed with organizational stakeholders in mind. A critical stakeholder is your employees and your employee experience. And a way to do that is to design your leadership behaviors, habits, actions, and make those expectations of leaders in your organization broadly available. Provide the training and support that leaders need in order to develop in those areas. Put it into a competency model and hold leaders accountable to those competencies. And we would say that 360-degree feedback is a very powerful tool in your ability to develop leaders in your organization and also to hold them accountable to those expectations that you're setting.
That's great. Dave and Christian, thank you so much. This is an enormous amount of information that you were able to put together in a succinct fashion and in the time that we have allotted. So thank you for that. Just as a reminder, we won't be sharing the slides from this webinar, but you can access this on demand on our Bright Talk channel or on our website. And we'll send out those links when we send out the email here in a little while for the SHRM and HRCI credit code. So thank you all for being with us today. Hopefully this has been very insightful for you.